CHAPTER V of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER V. Prosperous condition of Mr. Allen O'Donagough. A breaking out of fatherly affection. Early indications of character in Miss O'Donagough. Resolutions for the future. Agreeable news from England. Preparations for departure. Years wore away. Mr. Allen O'Donagough, as the good people of Sydney persisted in calling him, derived very essential advantage from the widely boasted and letter and present proved patronage of such connections. During the last years of his residence in New South Wales, he obtained, probably from the consideration this procured him, a place in one of the public offices, the salary of which was its least profit; for it enabled him to import advantageously various articles which he knew how to dispose of at enormous profit, so that he became by every day that passed over him a richer man. The benefits which this same forgiving kindness on the part of Mrs. Hubert conferred on her sometime aunt Barnaby, might perhaps be considered as greater still; for, wishing to be on confidential terms with my readers, it must be confessed that, had no such connections as the Huberts existed in England, it is more than probable that Mr. Allen O'Donagough, notwithstanding his advance in all steady economical financial habits, might still have been tempted to exhibit some immoral laxity of opinion on the subject of marriage. But for the hope that the one of all his professions which he loved the best, might be followed on a higher ground than had ever yet been within his reach through the influence of his charming Barnaby's connections, it is pretty nearly certain that, when the time arrived at which he deemed it convenient to recross the ocean, he would have found some means or other of leaving his lady and daughter behind him. These roving thoughts, however, gave way as the time approached to feelings of a nobler and more ambitious kind. Even Miss Martha O'Donagough, his little daughter, began by degrees to take a stronger hold upon his paternal affections. Whether arising from prolonged habits of celibacy, or a feeling of doubt as to how long their personal intimacy might last, or from any other cause, certain it is, that for the first 9 or 10 years of the young lady's life, his fatherly tenderness towards her limited itself to chirrupings while still in the cradle, about 1 pat on the head per week in the go-cart, and pretty frequent notices that she was not to make a noise afterwards. But a few weeks after the celebration of her 10th birthday, it chanced that a large packet arrived from London. Among other articles it contained a complete walking dress for Miss Martha, the bonnet being lined and trimmed, contrary to the usual quiet style of Mrs. Hubert's offerings, with particularly bright rose-coloured satin. The turkey cock is not more susceptible to the hue of red than was Mrs. O'Donagough. The instant that this well-packed article was cleared of its moorings, her rapture at the sight of it became vehement. " Matrimony has improved Agnes in one thing, that is certain," she exclaimed. " It is plain that she knows how to choose colours now, whatever she did formerly. I remember when we were at Cheltenham together that she perfectly pestered me with her recommendations of dull-coloured silks and ribbons. But look at this, O'Donny," an affectionate abbreviation, this adopted since the use of Major had been abandoned. " Look at this lovely bonnet, O'Donny, and then fancy how Martha will look in it." This enchanting bonnet, by the way, was chosen to gratify a whim of aunt Betsy's. She chanced to be present when the purchase was made, and begged so earnestly that this one might be sent instead of any of its more delicately tinted fellows, that her niece consented. " Thank you, my dear, you have given me pleasure," said the old lady. " It is agreeable to me to paint to my mind's eye the face of a daughter of Mrs. O'Donagough's, when enlivened by that glowing red. I have almost a mind to pay for it myself, Agnes, that I might have the pleasure of pointing out to you how truly the gift might assume the character of mercy, by blessing her that gives, and her that takes. Can you not fancy how your aunt Barnaby will look when it glories open upon her?" And the image which the old lady had just conjured up was as near as possible to the truth. The ci devant aunt Barnaby did appear to be in a state little short of ecstasy, as she turned and returned it upon her clenched fist. " Let us have her in this very moment, my dear. Do just go out and call her, will you?" " No, my dear, I certainly will not," replied Mr. O'Donagough deliberately, and at the same time thrusting his arm to the bottom of the box in search of newspapers, or anything else he might chance to find. " What a brute you do grow into !" retorted his wife. " And if I go myself, how prettily I shall find all the things rummaged about, shan't I?" Mr. O'Donagough deigned not to make any reply, but having found 2 or 3 newspapers, was either really or seemingly entirely absorbed in their contents. Happily for the preservation of Mrs. O'Donagough's temper, and the continuation of her enjoyment, the young lady in question at this moment entered the room. Her eye instantly caught sight of the rose-coloured ribbons, and every one who had observed her countenance at that time must have been forcibly struck by its resemblance to that of her mother, although in features, perhaps, she more resembled her father. The little girl had large, wide-opened black eyes, which easily kindled into considerable vehemence of expression. The shape of her face was like that of her father's, which was large and long. Her mouth and teeth, however, were those of her mother, of ample dimensions, bright in colour, both as to the white and the red, but having a sort of coarseness in the smile, which might perhaps enhance its beauty in the judgment of some, while it wholly destroyed it in that of others. The nose again was that of her father's, high, hooked, and threatening to become of a size more advantageous to a male than to a female face. Her hair was dark, and curled naturally and closely, while her complexion was brilliant almost to excess, being literally, and with no allowance made for figures of speech, composed of white and red. In person she was stout, strong-limbed, and very tall for her age, and on the whole presented an appearance which her mother had the comfort of feeling was very little short of perfection. " Oh my, what a beautiful bonnet !" exclaimed Miss Martha, darting forward to seize upon it. " It is no good, mamma, your holding it up that way out of reach, for it must be mine and nobody else's, because I am certain you could not poke your great head into it." " It is for you, my precious queen," replied her mother, " but it is I must have the joy of tying it under your beautiful chin. Don't crush the ribbons, darling, for your life." With great docility, and manifesting considerable powers of reflection, the child stood still while this operation of tying was performed, and then made an effort to bound from beneath the hands of her mother, in order to view herself in a little glass which hung between the 2 windows of the apartment. " Stay one instant, my angel !" exclaimed Mrs. O'Donagough, holding her. " I never did, no never in my whole life, Mr. O'Donagough, see anything 1/4 so beautiful as Patty looks in that bonnet. For God's sake, leave the news for one moment to look at her, and tell me how you shall like to show off such a face as that in London." Mr. O'Donagough graciously condescended to lift his eyes, and fix them on the little Patty, and for the first time in her life really thought her very well looking. There is something, even at 10 years old, in the consciousness of having a large quantity of bright rose colour reflecting itself upon one's complexion, which, together with a maternal assurance that one is the most beautiful creature in the world, tends to harmonise the features, and give a very sweet expression to the countenance. Little Patty stood peaceably for a moment with her hands before her, and her long eyelashes modestly cast down, so that when unable to resist the longing desire to look at herself for another moment, she bounded away to the further end of the room, her father said, with great feeling, " Yes, by heaven, I do think she will make a devilish fine girl after all ; and it will be a good thing if she does, I can promise you." " A good thing ? I believe so, indeed. Fancy such eyes and complexion as that, with a general's wife for a cousin, to take her out, and I don't know how many ladies of title to talk of to all her partners and everybody besides. My dear Donny, if we can but contrive to manage our affairs so as to make a tolerable show when we get to England, take my word for it, that girl will make a match that will perfectly astonish you. I am quite sure of it, perfectly certain. I have seen a great deal of life, and what is of more consequence, I have reflected a great deal on what I have seen. When I talk of Mrs. General Hubert's bringing Martha out, I mean nothing more, I assure you, than the merely taking her to court, and to a few other topping places, where just at first, perhaps, I shan't manage to get invited. But as to everything else, everything that concerns her general introduction among young men of fashion and large estates, I would not accept the services of anybody in the whole kingdom of England." During this first burst of conscious excellence from his wife, Mr. O'Donagough continued his assiduous study of the newspapers, and Miss Martha an almost equally assiduous study of her own little person in the glass. The difference between the degrees of intensity with which these occupations were carried on was this: the gentleman really heard not a single word that was said, whereas the young lady did not lose one. " I am taller than Kitty Jones, ma," said Miss Martha, standing on tiptoe. " Yes, yes, my dear, You will be tall enough, and beautiful enough too, you darling angel. Only you must always mind every word I say to you, for else neither beauty or tallness either will do you any good in getting a husband. Now take off the bonnet, Patty. Take it off this instant when I bid you." Nevertheless, Patty persevered in retaining her station before the glass, first making a pendant bow hang a little on one side, and then trying its ever charming effect when preponderating on the other. Considering the age of the little girl, it was really curious to watch her; and any observing student of natural history who had done so, would have perceived precisely the same phenomena which it is so interesting to follow in the young of all the countless tribes which form the animal creation, from man to a polypus. In each, the leading instinct of the species peeps out as easily, and with the same providential and unerring certainty, as the distinctive peculiarities of its organic formation, furnishing to a rightly constituted mind the most satisfactory proof that each is provided with exactly that sort of acuteness most necessary for its safety and well-being. But it was not in such subtle reasonings that the intellectual energies of Mrs. O'Donagough exhausted themselves. She marked the more obvious trait of disobedience in little Patty's delay, and, stepping with unexpected suddenness towards her, with one decisive hand removed the bonnet, and with the other bestowed on the offender a very effective box on the ear. In many respects this promising little girl appeared advanced beyond her age; and one proof of this was her having exchanged the childish scream with which little girls usually indicate their averseness to being cuffed, for an indignant frown, which spoke as great an inclination to cuff again as it was possible for a young lady to demonstrate to her mamma. This was a great relief to her father and mother, for before this incipient sturdiness of character appeared, it was by sturdiness of voice that her vigour, both of body and soul, declared itself, often rendering the needful castigations of Mrs. O'Donagough a sort of public nuisance in the street where she lived. But this was entirely over. Little Martha O'Donagough had cried her last cry for being beat, and now flashed her great eyes at her mother in a style that clearly foretold what their powers would be hereafter. But though Patty did not scream, the concussion roused the attention of her papa. " What's that for, ma'am? " he said hastily, and thereby for the first time evincing such an inclination to take the part of his daughter against his wife, as showed that the little lady's good looks in her new bonnet had produced a very powerful effect upon his mind. " Put on the bonnet again, Mrs. O'Donagough," said he. " She looked exceedingly well in it, and I want to see it again." It was impossible that the anger either of mother or daughter could resist this novel and very pleasing ebullition of paternal admiration. They both recovered their good humour instantly. The bonnet was tried on, again did little Patty look beautiful with all her might, and a general feeling throughout the family of that beneficent arrangement of nature which binds a whole race together, let distance separate them ever so widely, caused the father to say, addressing his wife, " Well, old girl, I won't deny that nieces and nephews are good for something." While she rejoined, " You may depend upon it, Donny, that blood is always thicker than water." And the youthful Martha completed the accord by exclaiming, " I am sure as I should like the people as sent this bonnet better than anybody else in the whole world." From that day forward, Mr. Allen O'Donagough continued to demonstrate a very marked degree of attachment to his young daughter. He even in some degree exerted himself to cultivate her mind, and improve her manners. Not, indeed, that he, at any time, submitted himself to the drudgery of giving regular lessons — such an attempt would have been altogether inconsistent with his habits, whether of pleasure or of business. But, apparently, he knew the value of that best mode of education, which consists in the constant and gradual inoculation of a parent's principles and opinions into the mind of a child ; and, as far as it was possible to judge of one so young, the result of this system, in the case of Miss O'Donagough, confirmed its often attested efficacy most completely ; for in mind as well as in body, she bore a splendid resemblance to both her parents. The last year of their long residence in New South Wales passed rapidly, for its term seemed within reasonable reach of hope and expectation. The bringing to a settlement and close all Mr. O'Donagough's very profitable speculations, left him little leisure for idle repinings that the desired hour did not approach more quickly ; and the pushing forward the ornamental part of their daughter's education, as completely occupied his wife. Both parents were anxious to take advantage of her premature height, and womanly appearance, in order to introduce her in the very first opening blossom of beauty. "She is but 13 and a bit, Donny," said Mrs. O'Donagough to her husband one evening that they were sitting tete a tete before retiring for the night. " I know that as well as any one can tell me. But I am not going to let her pass for a child for all that. There are some mothers of my age, and looking as I do, who would see her a nun before they'd make themselves older than needs must, by seeming to have a grown up daughter. But I'm above any such nonsense. There is nothing to be got by it now, whatever there might be if I was to happen to be left a widow again, and therefore I'm quite determined that Patty shall be dressed at once like a young woman." " I shall not make any objection to that, I promise you," replied her husband. " She is a most uncommonly fine girl — just the right sort, full of spirit and cleverness. Not that I'll promise you, Mrs. O'D., to marry her to the first man that asks. If she turns out as I expect, it will answer a great deal better to let her take time." Mrs. O'Donagough was about to make a somewhat lively reply, but checked herself, wisely remembering, that if a good match offered, she and Patty between them could manage matters easy enough, let all the fathers in the world do what they would to prevent them. And now the last busy month arrived, and fatiguing enough was the work they had to go through, in selling to the best profit all that was to be left behind, and packing in the least space all they intended to carry with them. In the midst of all this bustle, however, Miss Patty found the way to escape from doing anything she did not like, and having somewhat wilfully spoilt every article upon which her mother had attempted to employ her young fingers, she was permitted to escape from amidst the hampers and boxes which filled the house, in order to enjoy some farewell gossiping with the young Sheepshanks, and make their hearts ache by the lively contrast she set before them between their prospects and her own. It was during her absence that the last English newspapers they were likely to see before they left Sydney arrived. Notwithstanding the bustle he was in, Mr. O'Donagough set himself down upon the corner of a trunk, while, with his usual eagerness in the perusal, he began to run through the interesting columns. His lady, meanwhile, occupied at the other end of the room in carefully packing the stores which were to console them on their voyage, hardly lifted her eyes from the huge hamper she was filling, but with exemplary perseverance went on adding pickle pot to pickle pot, and sweetmeat jar to sweetmeat jar, without ever pausing to ask if there were any news. She was presently rewarded, however, by her husband crying out, " My Barnaby, our plottings prosper. The father of O'Donagough is dead. That old fellow was positively the only person living of whom I was much afraid. I can now undertake to prevent man, woman, or child from recognising me against my inclination ; and may snap my fingers, for instance, at the idea of any of your kith or kin remembering that they had ever seen me before. But I did not feel so sure, nor anything like it, about that old man's natural affection, as folks call it. 'Tis a weight off my mind, I promise you." " It's all the better, there's no doubt of that," replied his wife, pushing lustily to insinuate a salted tongue between two choice specimens of Sydney cheese ;" but with your cleverness, I can't say I should have been much afraid either of the old lord or of any one else." " Thank you, my dear, for your good opinion ; and perhaps you are not much out either. But I will tell you what this news will make me do, which I should not have ventured upon without. I shall always call myself, for the future, Allen O'Donagough. If anything unaccountable did happen, it might serve to prove that I did not pass under a false name ; not to mention that there may be more than one of the Sydney folks who may have need to write to me about sundry little matters of merchandise which I cannot quite give up as yet, and they will infallibly address me under that name." " But don't you think, my dear, that Agnes and her proud husband, and my sister Peters and her family, if we should ever fall in with them, would be very likely, if they saw you, and heard your name at the same time, to let one remind them of the other somehow ?" said Mrs. O'Donagough, who, in that quarter at least, was fully as anxious as her husband that he should not be recognised. " They may be reminded of me, my dear Mrs. O'Donagough, without knowing me," was the reply ; and as it was spoken with one of those peculiar smiles which she often saw on the face of her husband, and always with the feeling that they meant more than she could understand, she turned again her undivided attention to the packing, and by dint of her great exertion and perseverance, found herself on the wharf from whence they were to take their departure, with her husband on one side, her daughter on the other, and not a single packet either missing or forgotten. CHAPTER VI. Chapter VI of The Widow Married, a Sequel to The Widow Barnaby, by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Sorrows of the Sea, Comfort and Consolations, Baffled Hopes and Natural Indignation, Young Love. Notwithstanding that the wind was favourable, the vessel seaworthy, the crew civil, and better than all, the land towards which they were making such rapid way the very land of promise and of hope, Mrs. O'Donagough and Miss O'Donagough too were, to use a poet's phrase, very, very sick. That they should be very, very cross too, was on the whole quite excusable, because it is certain that under the influence of the first feeling, everything in heaven and on earth, and the water under the earth, is sure to generate the last. Mr. Allen O'Donagough, who was totally unconscious of any sensation of the kind, was very civil to his wife and attentive to his daughter for about half an hour after the malady seized them. But he then became weary of the repetition of attitude, and so on, which was quite unavoidable on the part of the ladies, but certainly uninteresting, to say the least of it, to everybody else; and he therefore took himself off to the very furthest extremity of the ship from that occupied by the suffering womankind, and there, comfortably seated on a chicken coop, with a cigar in his mouth, he dozed in luxury, half meditating, and half dreaming of Crockfords. Poor Mrs. O'Donagough was greatly to be pitied during nearly the whole of the voyage. It was so provoking to see the pickles and the sweetmeats, over the preparation and the packing of which she had toiled, gradually melting before her eyes, without her having ever been able, for a single moment, to venture them within her mouth. Miss Patty, however, got much better before she had been long at sea, and might soon be seen climbing up upon the taffrail, partly to receive the favouring breeze upon her face, and partly, perhaps, for the purpose of making some of the young sailors come and tell her that she must take care not to tumble overboard, and let the fishes pick out her pretty eyes. Among the crew of the Atalanta, which was the name of the fine merchant ship that bore the Allen O'Donagoughs across the ocean, was a lad apparently about 19 or 20 years of age, who very soon attracted the particular attention of Miss Patty. Nay, even Mrs. Allen O'Donagough, in her intervals of convalescence, more than once honoured him by a stare, that decidedly spoke of admiration. This youth's universal appellative was Jack, and, to judge by the multitude of occasions in every day upon which the name resounded from stern to stern, he was a person of very considerable importance in the manoeuvring of the vessel. This circumstance, taken singly, spoke well for the skill and nautical superiority of the boy. Yet there were other circumstances which might have led those who watched him closely to doubt whether he were indeed so very accomplished a sailor. For, in the first place, nobody ever saw him go aloft; and though, as we have said, he was continually called upon by name, more particularly by the sailors than the officers of the ship, whenever they were in want of a hand, it not unfrequently happened, when he obeyed the summons and set to work upon the business assigned him, a roar of laughter from his companions accompanied and followed his exertions. This, however, might have proceeded solely from his great popularity among them, and from the very particular pleasure they all appeared to take in his society. He was unquestionably one of those happy mortals, blessed by nature with the patent privilege of propitiating the good will of all on whom he turned his bright blue eyes. There was no resisting its gay playful glance, nor the smile either, by which he displayed the most perfect set of teeth ever set in a mortal head, almost every time he was spoken to. It is a long voyage from New South Wales to England, and even those who are best in health and gayest in spirits can hardly fail to experience that degree of weariness which makes every person and every occurrence within reach of observation important. Mr. Allen O'Donagough himself, though fully enjoying those best reliefs to tedium, the breakfasts, dinners, and suppers furnished by the careful preparations of his less happy spouse, so far shared this universal feeling as to amuse himself occasionally by joining with Jack in his good-humoured efforts to amuse Patty. No sooner was the breakfast hour past, than the young lady, let the weather be what it would, was sure to be seen climbing the cabin stairs, in order to get a game at ship billiards with Jack. Nor was Jack slow in his efforts to meet her wishes. No sooner did he perceive her bright eyes roving about the deck in search of him, than he sung out to any of the crew who happened to be within reach, " Avast there, Tom," or Dick, or Harry, or whomever else it might chance to be. " Avast there, and hand us a bit of chalk for the young lady." And a bit of chalk, to mark the series of circles that the game required, was never long waited for. Nay, so eager were the good seamen of the Atalanta to oblige either the young lady or their blithe comrade, that few among them failed, when thus called upon, to use the chalk as well as furnish it. and the ring within ring was often fairly drawn upon the deck, each marked with its respective number, and the circular slices of wood that served as bowls placed ready beside them, before Jack had concluded his first parley with Miss Patty, or answered half the questions respecting wind, weather, the ship's progress, and the flying fish, which she always came ready primed to ask. As soon as the game was fairly begun, Mr. Allen O'Donagough might generally be seen approaching, cigar in mouth, to watch the progress of it. Had he carefully marked the expression of his young daughter's countenance as he drew near, he might perhaps have perceived that she would have been quite as well pleased to keep Jack and the bowls to herself. But probably he did not mark it at all, and accordingly obtruded himself without scruple upon their game, generally proposing to set himself and his daughter against Jack, who was a great adept, and often appearing to take the most lively interest in the result. By means of this constant practice, Mr. Allen O'Donagough himself acquired by degrees very considerable skill in the game, and at length was apt to leave poor Patty out of it altogether, till the amusement was evidently become as important to his daily existence as to hers. It was not long ere Mr. Allen O'Donagough's habit of bringing all his intellect to bear upon every game, whether of skill or chance, in which he was engaged, placed him fully on an equality with Jack in that of ship billiards, and then he began greatly to long for a bet to excite anew the interest. A feeling pretty nearly allied to shame, enabled him for a few days to resist the temptation he felt to challenge Jack for a penny a game; but it lasted no longer, and setting all considerations of his own superior rank aside, he fairly addressed the lad in the language of perfect equality. " I say, Jack, what do you say, my boy, to our trying our luck for a penny a game? "" With all my heart, sir, if you will," was the reply, and to it they set, notwithstanding the openly expressed displeasure of Patty, who was fain to console herself by standing very close to her favourite when it was her father's turn to throw, and by romping with him a little now and then for the recovery of the bowl when both stooped together to pick it up. Mr. Allen O'Donagough was unquestionably much too rich a man to make the pennies for which he now played of importance to him. Nevertheless, habit, and a sort of instinctive ardour for success, even where success mattered not, led him to exert himself so effectually, that he speedily became the better player of the two. This appeared to pique the young sailor, and he likewise was frequently seen practising the game alone. At these times no one ever heard Jack called for, nor did any of the necessary duties of his profession appear in the least degree to interfere with his amusement. Poor sick Mrs. O'Donagough, whose greatest comfort was to have a parcel of coats and cloaks placed on the deck for her to lie upon, frequently amused herself by the hour together in watching both the practice and the game also, till at last it struck her that Jack, who, making allowance for his youth, and his wearing neither favoris or moustaches, she considered as decidedly the handsomest person she had ever seen, it struck her, I say, that Jack must either be the very idlest fellow that ever took service on shipboard, or that he was not the mere common sailor he appeared. No sooner had this last conjecture crossed her brain, than her curiosity became roused, and exerting herself vigorously, she rose from her recumbent posture, and dragged her languid limbs to the spot where Captain Wilkins, the commander of the vessel, stood leaning listlessly over the ship's side. Mrs. Allen O'Donagough leant over the ship's side too. " Good morning to you, Captain," said she, turning up her veil that she might both hear and see him more at her ease. " How are we getting on to day? "" Capital well, ma'am," he replied. " 8 knots an hour, steady." " That's good hearing, Captain Wilkins, for one that makes such a bad sailor as I do. And talking of sailors, do tell me something about that young man that they call Jack. I never saw such an odd, irregular young fellow in my life. Sometimes to hear the sailors calling him, first here, then there, as violently as if the whole safety of the ship depended on his coming, one might think he was just the best seaman on board. Then at other times he will do nothing but amuse himself for hours and hours together with tossing along that bit of wood as he is doing now. Do turn round and look at him, Captain Wilkins, and tell me if that's the way for a sailor to earn his wages." The captain turned his head for a moment to look in the direction Mrs. O'Donagough indicated, and then replacing himself in his former position, replied carelessly, " It is only because we go on so well, ma'am. Sailors have but little to do in fair weather." " Humph !" quoth Mrs. Allen O'Donagough, seemingly but little satisfied by the explanation ; but replacing her folded arms upon the side of the vessel, she contemplated the floating nautili, shining with their violet and silver rigging in the sun, as fixedly as if she were really thinking of them ; but it was no such thing. Her thoughts had never swerved for a moment from Jack. His handsome face, and his tall, slight figure, which, spite of his canvas trousers and checked shirt, had an air, a look, that seemed so— She was quite at a loss for a word to express what she meant, but had she been blessed with her friend Miss Morrison's familiarity with the tongues, she would unquestionably have added distingue. And then all the sailors, though they called him Jack so familiarly, doing just what he bid them with the chalk every day, and more than all, his flying full gallop to handle a rope now and then, just as if it was done for fun, though as to scouring the decks, or climbing up those horrid dangerous ladders of rope, or any other sailor work, that was anywise disagreeable, he no more seemed to have a notion of doing it than her daughter Martha. All this was puzzling in the extreme, and understand it she would, or else know the reason why. " But I say, Captain," she began again, but turning her head a little at the same moment she perceived that, most uncourteously, Captain Wilkins had left her side and was no longer in sight. " Vulgar brute !" murmured Mrs. O'Donagough in great indignation. " But if he is off because he won't tell me what I want to know, I'll be a match for him yet." On first screwing her courage to this enterprise of further inquiry, she turned her eyes towards the head of the vessel as the point where she was at once the most certain of encountering some of the men, and not of encountering their captain. But, poor soul, the undertaking was greatly beyond her strength, and after making a few tottering steps in the direction she wished to take, she was fain to stop short and seat herself. But though her walk before the mast was given up, her inquisitorial project was not ; and as soon as she had rested herself sufficiently once more to give her poor reeling brain fair play, she bethought her of a scheme worth a dozen of the last, and forthwith proceeded to put it in execution. No manoeuvring was required for this, in any degree at variance with her feeble condition, for it was only necessary that she should confess herself to be as ill as she really felt, and call for the steward to help her down stairs to her berth. Black Billy came at her call, and with his usual ready civility sustained the weight of the lady's heavy arm till he had safely landed her in the cabin. Black Billy was an excellent steward, and to all the multitudinous qualifications essentially necessary to deserving this character, he added a charm without which all the rest would have been imperfect ; for Black Billy was a most accomplished gossip. " Thank you, Billy, thank you," sighed the qualmish lady, as soon as she had placed her uncomfortable person on the black horsehair sofa. " But don't go away yet, Billy. I want to give you $half, because you are always so good natured to my daughter and me." " Tankee, ma'am," returned Billy, his eyes flashing at sight of the dearly loved coin. " Madam want itty drop some at goody goody?" " Why, I shouldn't care, Billy, if I did have half a glass of very, very weak cold rum and water." Billy was rattling amongst his bottles and glasses in a moment, and presently returning from the mysterious hole in which all the materiel for his important office was lodged, he presented the goody goody draught to Mrs. O'Donagough with an air that would not have disgraced the chef of Very's establishment. " Thank you, Billy, thank you," reiterated the kind spoken lady, adding, after a sip or two, " it is very comfortable indeed. But don't go, Billy. You shall have the glass in one moment, and then there will be no danger of its getting broke." Billy obediently stationed himself before her, and respectfully waited, plate in hand, to receive her glass. But Mrs. O'Donagough was in no humour to despatch its reviving contents hastily. " You make the best toddy I ever tasted, Billy. I am sure you are quite a treasure to the ship. How long have you been on board her, Billy? Dis is de fust voyage, please, ma'am. You seem to have a nice civil crew on board, Billy." " Yes, please, ma'am, all but nasty, filthy negger cook. And we must put up wid he, ma'am, 'cause you know he be but a beastly negger." " That Jack, as you call him, seems a good natured lad, with always a merry word for everybody. Do you know anything about him, Billy? " resumed the lady. " Oh, es, ma'am," replied Billy, with a very broad grin. " I knows all about em." " Do you, Billy? " replied Mrs. O'Donagough, eagerly. " I am very glad of it, for I want to hear all about him. Who is he, Billy, and what is he? Something out of the common way, I think, isn't he now, Billy? " This was said in the playful coaxing tone generally used by people who pique themselves upon their powers of cross examination. Billy, upon this, lowered his voice to a very confidential tone, as he replied, " Now bean't he a rum un, ma'am? He be de oldest boy eber come aboard as couldn't go aloft." But why can he not go aloft, Billy? That looks as if he had never been bred as a sailor, doesn't it?" Billy shook his head, but said nothing. " Now do tell me, Billy, you must know," continued Mrs. O'Donagough, " why did he come aboard dressed like a sailor? "" Jack stoopy lubber, wery stoopy lubber, ma'am," said Billy, looking extremely sagacious. " Yes, yes, Billy, so he is, perhaps, and something besides that into the bargain." " Es, ma'am, es," replied Billy, putting his finger to his nose, " so he bees." Mrs. Allen O'Donagough now thought the moment was come ; and throwing herself forward on her seat, and raising her eager eyes to the face of the negro, she exclaimed, " What, dear Billy ? For God's sake tell me what?" A very comic expression took possession of the shining face that was bent down to meet hers ; but though the fellow grinned from ear to ear, it was with a tone of great solemnity that he replied, " That bees a secret, ma'am." " Poh ! fiddle-de-dee for a secret, Billy, among friends. Tell me what it is, there's a good fellow." Billy grinned again, shut up his eyes very close for about half a minute, and then he said, " Him bees a reg'lar crocodile." " A crocodile, you black fool !" cried Mrs. O'Donagough, losing all patience. " If you think to treat a white lady passenger in that manner, and not get flogged for it, you are altogether out. If you don't tell me this moment all you know about the boy who they call Jack, I'll inform the captain that your behaviour is too impertinent to be borne, and we'll soon see what comes of that. Master Billy." Billy tried to look dismal, but his ivory teeth would make themselves seen in spite of him. However, he very soberly took up the glass which the lady had just before set down empty, and very decorously named the number of pennies she was to be pleased to pay for the same. This she knew was inevitable, such being the regulation on board the good ship Atalanta. Fortunately for her feelings, at the moment Mrs. O'Donagough chanced to have the exact sum ready in her pocket, in large copper coin, and drawing the pieces out, she raised her arm, and with all the strength she had, flung them, with a tolerably steady aim, in the face of Billy. Insult to a negro, if the tortured flesh quiver not beneath it, is never very deeply felt ; so Billy only shook his woolly sconce as if it had been exposed to a shower of hail, and without any symptom of ill humour, picked up the coin and retired. Mrs. O'Donagough felt very ill indeed. A violent fit of anger is one of the worst accidents that can occur in a case of sea sickness. It was quite as much as the poor lady could do to get to the state corner, for the best arranged merchant ships can hardly be said to have state cabins, in which her berth was constructed ; and having reached it, there she remained quietly enough for at least 3 hours ; the latter part of which time, however, was, happily for her, relieved by a tolerably sound nap — the greatest blessing that kind Heaven can send to a sufferer in her condition. She awakened from it greatly refreshed, and sufficiently herself again to slip off her bed, arrange her ruffled garments, add to her dress a wrapping shawl that she knew gave her an air of dignity, and then with her parasol in hand, she mounted the companion way in search of the captain. She found him standing with his arms behind him, still watching Mr. O'Donagough and Jack at their everlasting game ; while Miss Patty, as usual, was consoling herself for her exclusion from it, by following Jack's every movement with her eyes, and endeavouring with all her might to make him cheat her papa. It might be presumed, from external symptoms, that every emotion of anger disagreed very violently with the sensitive frame of Mrs. O'Donagough ; for it invariably caused an appearance of swelling over her whole person, and she now approached the group, who were amusing themselves on the quarter deck, with a gait and movement nearly resembling those of a stately turkey cock, when some circumstance has in like manner ruffled his plumage and his temper. Mrs. O'Donagough had not lost flesh during her residence in New South Wales. On the contrary, indeed, the greatest change which her appearance had undergone during the 15 years of her absence from her native shores, arose from the general enlargement of her person, and there was now, therefore, something exceedingly striking and impressive in her aspect, when under the influence of any indignant feeling. Mr. Allen O'Donagough, of course, knew these symptoms well, and, adopting his usual demeanour upon such occasions, appeared, instead of seeing her half as big again as usual, not to see her at all. But he need not have given himself the trouble of feigning, for he had nothing whatever to do with her present emotion, while the captain, who had continued to stand innocently unsuspicious, and without taking the least care of himself, within reach of her arm, was the sole object of her attention. It was gently, however, that she extended that arm, and laid hold of his. Captain Wilkins," said she, in a tone of voice which, notwithstanding her inward agitation, was more than usually civil, " Captain Wilkins, will you be so kind as to let me speak to you for half a moment ?" Though a very good sort of fellow in many ways, Captain Wilkins had less of that devoted and undiscriminating gallantry to the fair sex, which is usually found in men of his profession, that Mrs. O'Donagough could have wished. She was quite aware of this, and did not scruple to confess to anybody who would listen to her, that Captain Wilkins was no particular favourite of hers. The Captain, on his side, might have been aware of this also, or he might not ; but be that as it may, he did not like Mrs. O'Donagough at all ; and when, soon after they set sail, the first mate remarked to him that he thought Madame O'Donagough would still be a capital fine woman, if she was not so unaccountably big, the Captain replied, " There's no accounting for taste, Mr. Happerton, but to my fancy, she is altogether the most sprawling pattern of a female that I ever looked at on sea or land." When, therefore, he felt Mrs. O'Donagough's gentle touch, and her invitation to a tete a tete, he looked as if he would not have been at all sorry if his more easily pleased first mate could have taken the duty instead of him. However, he was much too civil to say so, and bending his head with something between a nod and a bow, replied, " At your pleasure, ma'am." " I must detain you one instant, sir," said the lady, hastening towards the retirement offered by a seat on the opposite side of the quarter deck. " Just sit down here one moment, and you shall hear quietly what I have got to say." " I prefer standing, ma'am, I thank ye," replied the Captain, placing himself before her at the distance of about 5 feet. " Dear me, Captain ! I don't want to bawl out so that the whole ship's crew shall hear me, and I shan't poison you, I suppose, if you do come a little nearer." Upon this Captain Wilkins made a step, but not a very long one, in advance, and again placed himself in act to hear. Mrs. O'Donagough felt as if she would have liked to throw him overboard ; but this did not prevent her again addressing him in a very civil, and almost in a coaxing tone, as she said, " My dear Captain Wilkins, I think it is my bounden duty not to keep you in the dark respecting the extraordinary impertinence of your black steward. I am quite sure, sir, that you were aware of it, you would take instant measures to prevent anything of the kind from ever occurring again ; and therefore it is that I make this point of speaking to you. Is it your wish, sir, that your black negro servant should insult your passengers, your lady passengers. Captain Wilkins ?" Now the truth was, that during Mrs. O'Donagough's refreshing slumber, Black Billy had been beforehand with her, and recorded to his master the whole scene which had passed between them ; a statement in which the Captain, without any undue partiality towards his steward, felt entire confidence, both from his knowledge of the parties, and from all the circumstances connected with Mrs. O'Donagough's curiosity, and Billy's resistance to it. However, his answer betrayed nothing of all this, for he only replied, " Oh no, ma'am, neither black nor white, we must have no insultings." " You had better not, sir, I can tell you, as far as regards myself. I presume that you are in some degree aware, though not so much as you might be, perhaps, that my daughter and myself are not to be looked upon at all in the same light as any other person on board ; nor my husband, Mr. O'Donagough, either, of course. My family and connections, sir, fill the very highest rank in English society, and a young lady who is going home, I may say, for the express purpose of being presented at court, is hardly to be considered as the same sort of thing as a Sydney grazier's wife, or the daughter of a felon consigned to her cousins in England, like that flaunting miss that is always trying to parade the decks with Miss O'Donagough, only I won't let her." " As to that, madam," replied the Captain, " I never in my life was guilty of making any difference whatsoever between one passenger and another ; if they all pay me honestly, they are all honest people to me, and I care not a straw about their grandfathers." " I have not asked you, sir, to make any difference ; any lady treated as I have been by an insolent blackamoor ought to know that he was punished for it." " And what, if you please, madam, do you think I ought to do to Black Billy, for not answering your questions about the young fellows of my crew ?" This sudden and unexpected retort again made Mrs. Donagough feel very unwell, and she heartily wished herself lying upon the cloaks and coats again ; nevertheless, her spirits did not desert her entirely, and she continued to say, " Upon my word, Captain Wilkins, you would consult your own interest better if you did take a little notice of the difference of station between one passenger and another, instead of treating them all alike with the vulgarity that seems natural to you. My interest, madam, is not very likely to be touched one way or another by my passengers. The Atalanta is no wise like an American liner, or a steamship moving between Dover and Calais. For you know, madam, if any of my customers was to cross back again, it would most likely be the king, God bless him, and not me, who would have the bringing of them." Here Mrs. O'Donagough became too ill to hear another word, and catching hold of a sailor who was passing, to take his turn at the helm, she got him to help her down stairs. When crawling again into her berth, she continued to lie there in no very comfortable position for several hours, till at length Miss Patty came to look after her, and by the help of a little coaxing, induced her to get up and show papa in which package the other jars of pickled onions could be found. For the rest of the voyage, Mrs. O'Donagough continued on very unsatisfactory terms, both with the captain and Billy, seldom indeed exchanging a word with either, and remaining altogether too sick and too much out of temper to make any further efforts for the discovery of Jack's secret history, if any such were in truth attached to him; a point upon which, happily perhaps for her own tranquillity, she began to be considerably less sanguine than when her researches commenced, for the youth satisfactorily proved his plebeian origin by never appearing conscious that so distinguished a person as herself was on board. " How can you bear to play every day with that vulgar boy as you do, you and your father too, Martha? It is perfectly wonderful to me how you can endure his manners. But any amusement, I suppose, is better than none, as long as we are confined to this beastly, horrid ship. Only you must remember, my dear, that when you get to England all things will be different. We must have no more vulgar acquaintance, if you please. But now you must go on playing, I suppose, with anybody you can find, for God knows I am too ill to amuse you myself." Such was the harangue uttered by Mrs. O'Donagough to her daughter when their voyage was about half completed ; and to avoid all unnecessary concealments, the soliloquy which followed it on the part of the young lady, as she turned from her mother and hung over the blue waves as they lashed the vessel on her course, shall be given likewise. " Vulgar boy ! That's your notion of a vulgar boy, is it? I don't care whether he is a sailor boy or a prince, not one single cent." It was thus that she deliberately murmured forth her steadfast mind. "But this I know, that if my dear, dear, beautiful, lovely Jack will only consent to marry me as soon as I am 15, and that's old enough for any woman, if he will only have me for his wife, I won't care neither for father nor mother, nor uncles nor aunts, no more than if they were so many brass buttons." Such were the sentiments of Mr. Allen O'Donagough's heiress when she had traversed half the briny space which divides the old world from the new ; and ere the remaining half was halved, her young heart was more thoroughly devoted still. But as the adventure which led to this is perfectly novel and highly interesting, it must have a chapter to itself. CHAPTER VII. Of the Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER VII. A romantic adventure which does now and then occur at sea — its sentimental consequences — Mr. Allen O'Donagough shaves himself — a discovery, but attended with no relief to curiosity — a farewell. It happened one morning after rather a squally night, that the youngest boy on board having been sent out to the extremest point of the bowsprit, for the purpose of setting to rights something that the blustering wind had made wrong, became so entangled in the tackle, and by his own unskilful attempts to set it right, as to become too thoroughly puzzled to handle it in the usual way; when, taking an unsailor-like hold of some rope or other, it failed him, he lost his head and his footing together, and with the piercing cry of a shrill young voice, that made itself heard athwart the hoarse grumbling of the fretted sea, dropped into the water. Happily the vessel was upon a tack, and did not pass over him, so that Jack, who heard the cry, and sprung instantly to the ship's side, saw the body rise at the distance of a few feet from him. It is not by the result of that valuable process of mind called meditation that great deeds are done by men or boys either. Had Jack meditated, he would have remembered that he was by no means a very skilful swimmer, and probably come to the conclusion that it would be unwise to put 2 human lives in jeopardy instead of 1 ; but as he did not meditate at all, an impulse which, if not better, was decidedly stronger than reason, caused him to jump upon the bulwarks and plunge into the sea after him. In an instant 3/4 of the crew were hanging over the ship's side, and eagerly handling ropes to throw after him. The captain, who had been among the first to see both the accident and the bold deed which followed, could hardly have been more zealous in his efforts to rescue the lads, if either or both of them had been his own. With his own arm he seized the helm, and put the ship about so skilfully as to bring her within a few feet of poor Jack, who was evidently struggling with difficulty to sustain the boy whom he had succeeded in catching hold of, while with his other arm he laboured to approach and seize upon the friendly rope that had been sent to help him. But the joint action of the wind and waves made this very difficult, and had not the captain's first order, which was to lower the boat, been promptly obeyed, Jack would never have puzzled or pleased fair lady more. As it was, however, the adventure ended in the very best style. The young hero and his protege were both laid safely, though perfectly insensible, upon the deck, with all the passengers, and nearly the whole crew, gazing upon them with all sorts of affectionate and admiring looks. But beyond all question, the person most acutely interested in the scene was Miss Martha O'Donagough. Like all other good female sailors, this young lady had a strong aversion to remaining below, and no sooner had the wind sufficiently abated to permit her to keep her feet upon the deck, than coaxing the captain to withdraw, for her at least, his prohibition against the appearance of the ladies in rough weather, she contrived to make her way to the side of the vessel, and rolling herself up in her cloak, with a firm grasp upon the bulwarks, to enjoy the fresh breeze after a very sorry night, together with the pleasant hope that her friend Jack would presently see and approach her. Nor was she disappointed. Jack did see her, and the next moment came laughing to her side, declaring that she must be a mermaid to look so well and happy in such weather. Then followed some delightful fun in watching the frolics of the tempest-loving tribes, who never condescend to visit the surface of the water when it is smooth; and then Jack helped to secure her bonnet more comfortably by putting a silk handkerchief over it, and tying it under her chin; and then her cloak wanted fastening, and very often she was in danger of being blown backwards, only Jack was so kind as to prevent it. In short, Miss Martha was enjoying herself exceedingly, when the cry of the falling boy smote their ears. The violent movement occasioned by putting about the ship, which she had to endure without any arm to help her, threw her down, and prevented her seeing either the floating body of the boy, or the noble effort made by her companion to save him. But no sooner had she recovered her feet and her hold upon the bulwarks, to which she firmly clung, notwithstanding the requests of many sailors that she would stand aside, that she perceived all that had happened, and from that moment ceased not to harass all around her by a succession of screams, till the boat and the 3 men let down in her, had done their work, and the 2 rescued lads were stretched before her on the deck. Then she screamed no more. Friendship claimed its rights, and undeterred by any idle scruples, Martha sat down upon the deck, and placed the head of poor Jack upon her knee. "Avast, my girl!" cried one of the men, whose exertions had saved him, "he must not be stifled up that fashion." But the cruel interference was of no avail, for at that very moment Jack opened his bright eyes, and began very hopefully to look about him. For a moment he seemed puzzled, and the first symptom of recovered memory was a short, quick question of, "Where is the boy?" "Here, Jack, here," responded from all sides, and the next feeling led, as it seemed, to a momentary communing within, for he put his hands before his eyes, and his lips moved, but without uttering any sound. Some movement of the young girl then caused him to look up, and he perceived where and how he was situated. "My dear little girl, is that you?" said he, in a voice that spoke much grateful feeling. A jovial laugh, and something very like a cheer from the surrounding group, at once seemed to welcome their favourite back to life, and to compliment the young lady upon her kindness. Jack, at the same moment, made an effort to rise, and Martha did the same; so they stood up together, both dripping wet with the sea water, and as neither Mr. nor Mrs. O'Donagough had yet left their beds, the captain took it upon himself to recommend that their daughter should go below and change her wet garments. This tall, stout, and decidedly precocious young lady, certainly never looked so nearly beautiful as she did at that moment. Much paler than usual, with large black eyes that shone through genuine tears, for she had truly been most terribly frightened, and, moreover, a little abashed at her situation, the young Martha could hardly fail of appearing both fair and interesting to the eyes of her playfellow. Jack looked at her much more earnestly than he had ever done before, and thought that she was not only the kindest hearted little girl in the world, but very handsome; a fact of which perhaps he had never till that moment been sufficiently aware. "Take care of yourself, my dear child," said he, very kindly, taking her by the hand; "but I must not touch you, Martha, for if I do, you will be wetter still." "And look to yourself, Jack," replied Martha, with equal kindness. I'll go and change if you will." "That's a bargain, then," he replied, smiling, but with very gentle feelings at her naivete. "And when we are all got dry again, it will be something to talk about, will it not?" Martha smiled too, and nodding to him with a look, the kindness of which was no longer veiled by tears, prepared to follow his advice, and by the help of his steadying hand reached the companion-way and descended. This adventure could not easily be forgotten by either. Neither was it. Jack long considered Martha as the kindest hearted and prettiest girl in the world, and Martha considered Jack as the perfection of sweethearts, and the model of everything that was handsomest in the male creation. This occurrence helped on, at least to the young people, the last lingering weeks of the voyage; for not only did it, as Jack had prophesied, give them something to talk about, but the ardent gratitude of the fine lad he had saved, and the daily increasing interest that Martha testified for all that concerned him, could not but touch so tender a heart as Jack's, who, moreover, always remembering that he was but a poor sailor boy, conceived a strong feeling of gratitude and esteem for the young girl, whose unsophisticated nature led her so completely to overlook all distinctions of rank. To Mr. and Mrs. O'Donagough, indeed, all this produced no good effect, but rather the contrary; for Jack grew tired of ship billiards, and greatly preferred standing by his little friend Martha, as she sat perched upon the taffrail, and with her strong clear voice sang love ditties to the fishes by the hour together. And poor Mrs. O'Donagough fared not at all the better for this additional leisure of her husband's, for he was getting exceedingly restless, rather bilious, and now and then very cross; so that, considerably before they arrived at the port of London, they both became aware that they had been shut up together quite long enough. Two trifling circumstances only, both occurring within the last week, caused a short intermission of poor Mrs. O'Donagough's yawns, by giving her something puzzling to think of. The first of these was seeing her husband, Mr. Allen O'Donagough, mount the cabin stairs one fine morning, with his face as cleanly shaved from top to bottom, and from side to side, as it was possible for a razor to do it. Not a trace, not a vestige of either moustache or favori remained, to show that the military glory of that expansive face had once been. The change produced upon his countenance by this operation was very great, and, to say the truth, by no means favourable; for little as we may some of us admire the flashy look which every chevalier d'industrie can obtain by only restricting the office of his razor, it is nevertheless certain that a great high-boned vulgar face, like that of my heroine's present husband, is in no degree improved by being rendered more broadly visible. At the first glance his wife did not know him, nor was it indeed till he had displayed the whole extent of his large white teeth in a smile produced by her unconscious stare at him, that she did. The time when she had almost worshipped the military insignia of his upper lip, and doted on the copious manliness which veiled his ample jaws, was certainly past, probably never to return, yet could she not look with indifference upon what appeared to her so terrible a falling off in the striking comeliness of his appearance. She had hitherto never ceased to consider him as a remarkably dashing and fashionable looking man, but now her eyes, as well as her heart, told her that he was not so at all. " Good heaven, Major Allen !" was her first involuntary exclamation, " what on earth can have induced you to make such a figure of yourself?" The gentleman suddenly ceased to smile as she spoke, and answered in a low growling voice, which showed that he had not, like Samson, lost his spirit with his hair. " And what, madam, can make you call me by a name which I have commanded you never to utter again?" Poor Mrs. O'Donagough was really frightened, and notwithstanding the high spirit on which she prided herself, condescended to say, " Oh, dear me, Mr. O'Donagough, don't be angry. I will never say it again, upon my word and honour. And nobody heard me, you know, that's a comfort. But what did you cut off your beautiful whiskers for?" " You are a fool, Mrs. Allen O'Donagough," was the short reply ; and never again was the circumstance alluded to between them. But it cannot be supposed that Mrs. O'Donagough forgot it, or that she could avoid feeling rather uncomfortably anxious as to what motive could have induced so very handsome a man to disfigure himself so dreadfully. " If it had only been his moustaches," thought she, " I should not have cared ; and indeed I know that it would have been perfectly necessary — how else could he possibly pass himself off for the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough? No reverends ever do wear moustaches, that's quite true ; but those beautiful whiskers, that gave him so completely the air of a man of fashion, there could have been no occasion to shave them." I know the irregular clergy, like my last poor O'Donagough, wear whiskers quite as often as not — not little shabby whiskers either, such as a bishop might wear, and no harm done — but just such full noble whiskers as as this foolish man wore. However, it's no good to fret. If anything was to happen to him, and I was to marry again, I'd take good care to know, if 'twas in the old world or the new, whether there was any likelihood of the man's wanting to scrape his skin, for all the world like a pig prepared for roasting. This one only wants singeing a little to make him perfect." The other circumstance which tended in some degree to relieve the wearisome tedium of Mrs. O'Donagough's last few days at sea, was something like a discovery which she at last made respecting the young sailor lad called Jack. By special agreement, Mr. and Mrs. O'Donagough and their daughter dined in the cabin, and at the table of the captain, though like all other passengers on board, they furnished their own provender ; but a few pounds additional to their passage money had secured to them the dignity of this privilege, which was the more precious because shared by no other passenger. From some suspicious reason or other, which Captain Wilkins had never explained, his dinner hour, and consequently that of the O'Donagoughs, had been changed after they came on board, and fixed considerably earlier than before. Dining, however, is so welcome an amusement on board ship, that nobody complains of its coming too soon, and the alteration was never objected to. The weather during the whole passage having been, with few exceptions, remarkably fine, it was the custom of the O'Donagough family to repair to the quarter deck as soon as the dinner was over, and there indulge in nibbling biscuits and sipping toddy. Miss Patty, during this hour of systematic gossiping, fared not so well as her parents ; for, to do her justice, she was not at all fond of toddy ; and Jack, of whom she certainly was very fond, for some reason or other was never visible on the deck at these times. That he was indeed not on deck, little Patty was perfectly competent to declare, for more than once had she vainly traversed its entire length from stem to stern in search of him. She could not, unfortunately, penetrate to any of the mysterious recesses below ; that she had with some little difficulty been made to understand was impossible ; but she would willingly have ransacked the cabin and all its dependencies in search of her friend, only she found, upon once attempting the experiment, that the door was locked. These efforts to find her playfellow, however, and the disappointment which attended them, were alike confined to her own bosom ; and as her father was, as we have seen, very comfortably engaged, and her mother, if possible, still more so — for she took her biscuits and toddy from the luxurious couch of coats and cloaks heretofore described — the absence of the lad at this hour, constant and regular as it was, had never been noticed by either. It so happened, however, the very day on which the Atalanta entered the British Channel, the weather being beautifully calm, and the sea as yet in no degree affected by the narrow and troublesome path it had got into, that Mrs. O'Donagough, feeling herself particularly well and lively, scorned the repose offered by her cloaks and coats, and trotted down the cabin stairs in search of a basket in which many hourly requirements were stowed, and, among others, the last letter of her niece, Mrs. General Hubert. To this letter, it must be confessed, she had made very frequent allusion during the passage, whenever she could get anybody to listen to her ; but, nevertheless, she wished to consult it again now, because it contained something about her darling great niece Elizabeth, the eldest daughter of her beloved Agnes, and often as she had read the letter, she could not, as she assured Mr. O'Donagough, exactly recollect whether the dear girl was 13, or only 12 and a half. As it was Mrs. O'Donagough's luxurious custom to wear list shoes on board, she went down the companion way with very little noise, and applying her hand to the lock of the cabin door, it turned and admitted her. Great, indeed, was her astonishment at what she saw before her. The usual cabin dinner table was covered with a marvellously clean cloth, on which was spread, with great attention to neatness, and even some display, all the requisite for a substantial repast. A single glance, it was to be sure a long and steady one, sufficed to show Mrs. O'Donagough that not only great pains had been bestowed upon the dressing it, but that the articles of which it was composed were of the most delicate quality that a long voyage can permit. 2 bottles of wine flanked the single plate, to supply which, the various dainties were prepared, and before that plate sat Jack. Yes, it was Jack in solitary state, in his usual nautical, and not over clean exterior garments, but with the air of being most perfectly at his ease, and of feeling himself anything but an intruder in the place he occupied. At sight of Mrs. O'Donagough, however, his colour certainly mounted considerably, and he rose so suddenly, and with an air so vexed and confused, that had she not known the captain's dinner to have been long over, she might have been tempted to believe that the lad was caught in the act of pilfering what had been prepared for his betters. But as it was, she stood perfectly amazed, astounded, petrified, and puzzled. Many weeks had passed since she had ceased to trouble herself about Jack and his unsailor-like ways; for, finding it impossible to discover the secret, she gradually became convinced that there was none, and all interest in him had died away accordingly. An additional reason for which might probably be, that the lad never by any chance came near enough to speak to her, if it could by possibility be avoided. But now all this reasonable and dignified tranquillity of spirit was again destroyed. That there was something very particular indeed in the situation of Jack, it was impossible to doubt, but to discover what was beyond her power. The youth, having mumbled something about having a joke with the captain, passed by her and mounted the stairs, leaving her to all the torments of unassisted conjecture, from which the most accurate examination of the relics of Jack's banquet could not relieve her. In fact, the only thing she could find worthy of arresting her attention was a silver fork. This, she discovered on examination, was made to receive the blade of a knife into its handle, and a little further search enabled her to discover the said knife also, and to ascertain that it not only fitted nicely, but that the style and workmanship of this bit of travelling luxury was of a costly kind. For mere curiosity's sake she would have liked well enough to put the united articles into her pocket; but as the lively thought arose, the recollection that she was on board a ship coming from Botany Bay came with it, and she discreetly laid the pretty things where she had found them, retaining only the interesting fact that they were both marked with the letter S. From that hour to the end of the voyage, which was just 5 days, including the passage up the river, poor Mrs. O'Donagough was never able to obtain from any one the slightest glimmer of light on this mysterious subject. As the vessel passed Sheerness, a boat was sent on shore, in which she perceived through the cabin windows, as the little craft passed astern, that a great quantity of luggage had been stowed. Unluckily for poor Mrs. O'Donagough, she was at the moment busily employed in some necessary packing operations, which the approach to land rendered indispensable, and her view therefore of this parting boat was so indistinct that she did not recognise the brown curls and blue eyes of Jack under the foraging cap that was seated at the stern. Neither did she, from the same unlucky accident, witness the very affectionate farewell exchanged between this provoking boy and the whole of the ship's crew. There was another farewell rather more affectionate still, which also she did not see; but it was not only her being in the cabin which prevented this, for it was behind a heap of canvas which concealed them from all eyes that Jack gave a parting kiss to Patty. Chapter 8 of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Our Native Land. The happiness of returning to it. A visit to the Custom House, with a sketch of female sufferings not unusual there. Miss O'Donagough's filial feelings explained. At length the boat was alongside, which was to convey my heroine, her husband, and daughter, to those dear dirty steps beside the Custom House of London, the stumbling up of which has occasioned joy and gladness to so many hearts. Our party had, of course, a considerable quantity of luggage to remove, and to this Mr. O'Donagough gave pretty nearly his whole attention. But somehow or other his wife and daughter got safely into the boat in the midst of it, and the whole freight, after the usual quantity of noise and bustle, was securely rowed to the landing place and disembarked. " At last, Patty! " exclaimed Mrs. O'Donagough on reaching the highest step. " Here we are. Oh, how glad I am that we have done with that beastly ship! If the sight of every rope in her did not make me as sick as a cat, I'll be hanged. Come, dear, get on, you must not begin staring yet. Bless you, child, this is nothing but the very nastiest outskirts of London. There is nothing here worth opening your handsome eyes upon, Patty. Come along, come along. There goes your father into the Custom House, as I take it, and we had best stop outside and watch the men bring up the rest of the goods. Lord! What a quantity they do carry, to be sure. There goes my bandbox. If your father had not been a fool, he might have contrived to smuggle that. but I never will forgive him if he does not bring it out again this minute. Past or not past, as he calls it, have it I must and will." To all this Patty made no answer whatever. She was too much occupied and preoccupied to care for anything her mamma could say. In fact, her thoughts were revolving with the regularity of a shuttlecock between two battledores, from the kiss Jack had given her off Sheerness to the busy throng moving in all directions round her. After an interval, so short as to prove that Mr. O'Donagough was a practised and a skilful traveller, he was seen to emerge again from the portal of the Custom house, when his wife, who was stationed close to it, pounced upon his arm with genuine conjugal approbation, a manoeuvre, by the way, well described by Shakespeare, when he says, "She arms her with the boldness of a wife," and exclaimed, "What a time you have been, O'Donagough! Where is the bandbox? Why, surely you have not come away without it? You know as well as I do that I must have it, and I'll bet £1,000 that is exactly the reason you have left it." "No, my dear, it was not, I assure you," he replied, with very businesslike composure. "It was because the Custom house officers would not let me bring it on account of the sweetmeats." "Sweetmeats, Mr. O'Donagough? Then why did you not let them take out the sweetmeats? You know perfectly well, though now you pretend to look exactly as if you had never heard of it, you know that it is not the sweetmeats that I want, but my dressing box. I declare to heaven I would as soon have an owl look after my things." "Nonsense," said Mr. O'Donagough, composedly. "I am going to call a coach for you. I shall tell the man to drive to the Saracen's Head, and there you must order dinner and beds. No, upon second thoughts, my dear, you had better order tea. It makes, as I well remember, a monstrous difference in the bill, and we may eat, you know, exactly as much cold meat as we like." Here Mr. O'Donagough held up his finger to a hackney coachman, as readily as if he had not been beyond reach of any such luxury for nearly 15 years. But when, with a hand applied to his young daughter's elbow, he was in the very act of assisting her to mount the uncertain steps, he was startled by the voice of his lady exclaiming within an inch of his ear, "How can you, O'Donagough, be such a fool as to make believe that you think I shall go off without my bandbox? I shall not stir a step without it, and that you know. What a thing it is to have a man belonging to one that can't look after such a trifle as that! But it is no matter, I can do it myself." And with these words, Mrs. O'Donagough rushed into the Custom house with the aspect of a tigress seeking her young. There was the same thrusting forward of the lengthened neck, the same eager starting of the protruding eye. And who shall say that there was not the same throbbing emotion at her heart? Mr. O'Donagough very improperly gave his daughter a look that seemed to say, "Did you ever?" and having desired her to sit quietly in the hackney coach till they returned, he followed the wife of his bosom with long but deliberate strides, as she won her way to what appeared the most busy part of the vast edifice. He overtook her just in time to hear her say, with astonishing dignity, though panting for breath, "Pray, sir, will you be pleased to inform me if it is here that the passengers' luggage from the Atalanta has been deposited?" "The man who is now passing down the room, ma'am, can tell you," was the reply. Away flew Mrs. O'Donagough after the individual thus indicated; but the man moved quickly, and it became speedily evident that she must raise her voice to overtake him. "Will you tell me where the luggage from the Atalanta is stowed?" screamed the flying lady at the very highest pitch of her voice. But this effort also was in vain, for a multitude of other sounds blended themselves with the voice of Mrs. O'Donagough, and the official hurried on. Vexed, heated, weary, but more determined than ever to perform what she had undertaken, if only to prove how wretchedly inefficient in all such matters her husband must be, she continued to run on with all the velocity that a heavy cloak and the ample volume of her own person would permit, till at length the man she was pursuing stopped, and at the same instant her eye caught sight of the bandbox, the abduction of which from the boatman who brought them on shore had caused her so much inquietude. "This is it, this is the box I want, sir," she exclaimed, extending her arm to seize her recovered treasure. "By your leave, ma'am," said another official, taking hold of it with professional firmness, but perfect civility, "it is going this way." "It can't go that way, sir, I must have it. I do assure you it is perfectly impossible for me to get into the coach without it, and I am quite confident that, as a gentleman, you can't refuse to let me take away such a trifle as this one bandbox." "It has been looked into," said another officer, "and is crammed full of sweetmeats. It must pay duty." Dear me! Pay duty, sir, for a dressing box? I don't care a straw for the sweetmeats, comparatively speaking, and Mr. O'Donagough must of course pay the duty if he chooses to have them. All I ask for is my dressing box, and I shall think it a most disgraceful thing to the English nation if a lady is to have her very dressing box taken from her the moment she puts her feet on English ground. I am sure the very savages themselves would know better. And what's more, I don't believe it is legal to seize it, for I have used the same and no other for years and years, and you may depend upon it that if there is anything illegal in the matter, the thing won't pass without notice. My connections are not in a rank of life to permit anything of that kind. It may be all very well for common people to have their property snatched out of their hands this way, but it won't do for the aunt of General Hubert." Mr. O'Donagough, who had by this time reached her side, stood with more nonchalance that was quite amiable, while his indignant wife thus exerted herself. Nay, some persons might even have suspected that he was base enough to quiz the vehement energy of her pleadings ; for not only did he remain perfectly silent, but now and then exchanged such a look with the individual with whom she was contesting the legality of the transaction, as might have easily been construed into joining in the laugh against her. Fortunately for the preservation of the King's peace on the spot sacred to the collection of his own customs, Mrs. O'Donagough was too completely occupied to be aware of this, and it was only when at length she ceased to speak that she perceived her husband beside her. " I do wonder, Mr. O'Donagough," she then began, " how you can stand there like a statue, without ever uttering a single syllable, good, bad, or indifferent. I do believe you are the only man in the whole civilised world who would let all the trouble of travelling fall upon his wife in this way. Pray, sir, do make the people understand that the coach is waiting for me, and that it is impossible I should go without my dressing box." " Why, my dear, you and I don't do business in the same way. Pray, sir, how long will it be before our things can be passed? These are the articles in this corner, just 12 packages, great and small. When will they be looked over? " Within an hour, sir." " Now then, my dear, make up your mind. Will you wait here yourself 1 hour, till you can see the whole lot sent off? Or will you go on to the Saracen's Head, and leave me here to get it done? Or will you prefer my going with you, and returning here again, after I have seen you and Martha safely lodged? There is hardly anything in the world so provoking, when one has worked oneself up to a considerable degree of energy, as to be made to perceive, as plainly as that 2 and 2 make 4, that no energy at all was necessary. Mrs. O'Donagough would at that moment have given anything short of her dressing box, if without danger she could have bestowed upon her husband a good cuff. But she restrained herself, and only replied, " Oh, pray do not trouble yourself to go with us. I am sure I hope there is nothing going to happen in which you could do any good. Stay if you like, and as long as you like, and let all the things be seized, one after another, without putting out your finger to prevent it. I don't care a straw about it. It would be convenient, certainly, for me to get my dressing box before I go ; but as you do not choose to take any trouble about it, of course I must submit. Few gentlemen, I fancy, would like to see their wives treated in this sort of way, particularly about a thing that I took out of England myself years and years ago. However, I shall say no more about it. I know the transaction to be perfectly infamous in every way, and that's all I have to say on the subject. General Hubert, or Lady Elizabeth either, will be able to tell me whether it will be worth my while to take any further notice of it. The importance of the thing itself is comparatively nothing, but no man of spirit, I presume, would choose that his wife should be treated with fraud and indignity. That's all I wish to observe." This speech was intended for all within hearing, but it is doubtful whether any one besides her husband heard a syllable of it. There is, perhaps, no place in which the constitutional propensity of the gentler sex to relieve their full hearts in words, is endured with more unresisting passiveness than in scenes of active public business. The stream is generally permitted to flow on without let or hindrance ; and if, as usually happens, no attention is paid to it, the obvious reason lies in the judicious earnestness of the functionaries to perform the ladies' wishes, without pausing even to listen to their eloquent expression of them. Mrs. O'Donagough waited a few seconds for an answer, but receiving none, either from her husband or any one else, she turned suddenly round upon a person actively engaged in the examination of a host of trunks just arrived from France, and said, " Am I to have my dressing box, sir, or not?" The man looked up at her for an instant, but pursued his employment without answering. " What insufferable insolence she exclaimed, fronting round again to Mr. O'Donagough. " I am perfectly persuaded that there is no nation in the world where such conduct would be endured except this. And I believe also," she continued, somewhat in a lower voice, and preparing to leave the room, " I believe also that there is not another man in existence who would suffer his wife to be thus treated without resenting it." " You will get these things in the corner looked over next, will you ?" said Mr. O'Donagough, with the most perfect composure. " Yes, sir, I will," replied the man he addressed, with such unalterable civility, that Mrs. O'Donagough began to suspect no scolding, however violent, could do any good ; and having fortunately arrived at this conclusion, she condescended to take her husband's arm and walk off; muttering, however, the whole way some very biting observations on the difference between some men and other men. But Mr. O'Donagough was in no humour to make a fuss about it, and continued to whistle " Oh, the roast beef of old England," and " Oh, the old English roast beef," till they reached the hackney coach, in which they had left their young daughter. Many papas and mammas would have felt some scruple, if not a little fear, at the idea of leaving a young lady of 14 in a scene so noisy and so new, as the street in front of the London Custom house ; but it is more than probable that they both of them knew sufficiently well the excellent condition of the young Martha's nerves to prevent all notion of such idle alarms. They found her, as most likely they expected, still unsatiated with the delights of staring at all the people, and all the carts, and all the horses, and all the boxes, which were passing in a whirling maze before her view. " Well, chicken," cried her father, inserting his face between that of his wife and the window of the hackney coach, " are you not tired of waiting for us ?"" Tired ?" replied the young lady. " Not I. Never saw such fun in my life. What have you been doing, mamma, all this time? It is a thousand pities you should not have seen all these people pass. There must be some monstrous great arrival in England to day, I am sure." Mr. O'Donagough laughed. " I am glad you have been amused, chick," said he, standing a little aside, while his lady was getting into the coach, " and I should like very well to hear all you have got to say about it ; but you must tell me all when I come." " Lor, papa, you ain't going to stay here, are you? " said Martha, in a voice that betokened disappointment. " How can you be so absurd, child? " said her mother, sharply, drawing up the window of the coach within exactly 1 inch of her husband's nose. " For God's sake let us make him useful if we can. He is by no means too well inclined that way, I promise you." When a factious and rebellious spirit gets possession of a woman, it gives her a degree of courage that is often quite astonishing. Mrs. O'Donagough knew, as well as she did that the sun would rise on the morrow, that however enduringly her husband might receive for a time the rebukes and scoffings of her contumacious spirit, he would settle the account fairly with her at last, and this with a manly preponderance of force which to any woman possessed of less audacious vigour of mind would have been really alarming. Perhaps, indeed, Mrs. O'Donagough herself was not always entirely free from trepidation, when these moments of retribution arrived. Yet it was very rarely that the fear of them was sufficiently powerful to check her conjugal vivacities. Mr. O'Donagough did not like having the coach window drawn up within an inch of his nose, and employing the skilful manoeuvre by which servants outside a carriage let down a glass forgotten by the ladies within, he managed to remove the barrier thus interposed between himself and his womankind. " What the devil is the matter with you, madam? " said he, in a voice that caused more than one passing eye to turn round upon him. " Don't tire me, Mrs. O'Donagough," he added in a lower tone, " or by Jove, you may wish I had left you behind at Sydney." Mrs. O'Donagough was at this moment very advantageously situated for receiving the burst of wrath which she knew had been accumulating during the last half hour. She dared not, indeed, attempt to draw up the window again, but raising herself on her feet, as nearly as the roof of the carriage would let her, she sat down again in the corner with a degree of vehemence, which made the crazy springs of the vehicle dip under her as if never to rise again ; and in lieu of her magnificent countenance presented so broad, thick, and seemingly impregnable a shoulder to her spouse, that he felt he was worsted, and showing his large row of still white teeth to his daughter, as with a backward movement of his thumb he pointed to the massive shoulder, he stepped back upon the pavement, calling out at the same time to the coachman, to " drive to the Saracen's Head, Snow Hill." Martha made a movement that brought her face parallel to the opposite window, and her shoulders to those of her mamma's, so that the laugh produced by her papa's facetiousness was not observed. " Brute !" exclaimed Mrs. O'Donagough, as the carriage drove off.
Oh, my gracious, what a beautiful bonnet that is ! And that, and that !" cried the young lady, as they passed a shop window. " Shouldn't I look beautiful, mamma, with those green feathers ?"" Perhaps you might, my dear," replied her mother ;" and you must be as sharp as a needle, Patty, I can tell you that, to get what you want out of your skinflint father. He'll be smart enough himself, I'll answer for him, for he is as vain as an old peacock ; but as for us and our appearance, he won't care much, I dare say ; and a hard tug we shall have before we can get anything decent out of him — mark my words if we don't." Of her two parents, Miss O'Donagough decidedly liked her papa the best, but she was already much too good a tactician to let this appear before the eyes of her mamma. She felt, indeed, her daily increasing power over both, and as deliberately determined to make the most of it, as if she had studied the curious and incalculable effect of skilfully applied domestic influence for years. One means she had long ago discovered as beyond all others effectual in promoting this, was the seizing of every safe opportunity of making each fond parent believe that she was quite willing, if she dared, to become his or her partisan upon all occasions against the other. Some idea of her acute and almost precocious talents may be gathered from the fact, that she had already persuaded her father of her perfect enjoyment of all the ridicule he from time to time slyly threw upon his lady ; and her mother that she considered her as exceedingly ill used whenever she failed of having her own way in every contest she fell into with her master and her lord. Mrs. O'Donagough had changed but little in her feelings and principles of action since the day when she arrived at the hotel at Exeter, with her niece Agnes and Betty Jacks. She still bore herself as one deserving of all deference and respect, and called about her on arriving at the Saracen's Head, as if nobody so great had ever driven under its awful sign before. The first waiter who met her passed on, exciting thereby her deepest indignation ; but at length her loud and dignified demand, " Can we have beds and supper here?" produced something like the desired effect ; and she was ushered into a little dusky, dirty, up-stairs sitting room, from the window of which, however, Martha had the gratification of finding that she could look out upon the street. It was the latter end of the month of August, and no one, perhaps, but a young lady just escaped from the ship that had brought her from New South Wales, could have found such keen delight in gazing upon the hot and dusty precincts of Snow Hill. To her, however, it was a sort of opening paradise, in which she fancied she could dwell for ever without becoming weary. " What quantities of carriages, mamma ! And oh, good gracious, the men ! And such bonnets and flowers ! If papa won't give us some money, I'm sure we shall grow wild." " Yes, to be sure we shall," replied her mother, who, with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, and her head protruded farther still than that of the young lady, hung over the pavement, enamoured of all the metropolitan splendour she saw passing there. " London is a glorious place, there is no doubt of that, mamma," said Martha. " The finest in the world, everybody says so ; and I am sure it is impossible to stand here and doubt it," replied her mother. " But do you know, Patty, I am dying with hunger. I suppose your father would kill us, if we ordered tea before he came ?"" I am sure it would be very savage of him to want to keep us starving here, while he is amusing himself with all the beautiful things as he comes along," replied the young lady. " Well, my dear, if you have courage to face it, I don't care. He was in a brutal ill humour when we drove off, but I suppose if you tell him that you were feeling so sick and faint that you thought you should die, he won't say much about it. So if you feel courage for it, I'll ring." " Oh, lor, mamma ! I feel courage enough, if that's all. I'm sure I could eat a dozen rounds of buttered toast for my own share. Ring away, mamma. I'll stop papa's mouth when he comes. You see if I don't." Thus encouraged, Mrs. O'Donagough did ring, and her liberal orders given quite in the Silverton Park style, for tea, toast, muffins, eggs, cold chicken, and ham, were obeyed with admirable promptitude, and the mother and daughter had got half through the tea urn, and very nearly quite through all the eatables upon the table, when Mr. Allen O'Donagough made his appearance. " Civil and obliging, upon my word !" he exclaimed, with a touch of very natural feeling, as he entered the room. " While I have been fagging like a blackamoor to get your cursed things through the customs, you two sit down and devour everything that is to be had, without troubling yourselves for a single instant to think of me." " If you say that, you are a very wicked man, because you will tell fibs," replied his daughter. " We did think of you, and talk of you too, a great deal before we set to. And it was I told mamma that I was sure as sure that you wouldn't and couldn't be angry. Just think, papa, the difference of sitting stock stone still up here, longing for a morsel of food to keep soul and body together, and being busy and blithe in the midst of all the beautiful sights like you have been." While saying these words, Martha employed herself in preparing on one fork a huge collop of ham, with a lump of fowl to match it, and on another an equally full-sized morsel of boiled beef daintily covered with mustard. "Now here's what I call 2 beautiful mouthfuls. Open your gills, papa. This one first, 'cause the mustard is strongest. Well, how do you like it? Very good, is it? I thought so. Now this. And that's very good, too, it seems, by your manner of munching it. Now say if I hadn't thought about you. I told mamma I'd stop your mouth, and all you've got to do is just say which you like best, and more will come of it, I'll be bound, as soon as you order it." There was something so exceedingly clever and so prettily playful in this device of the young Martha to restore her hungry father's good humour, that both parents were delighted with it. Mrs. O'Donagough got up laughing and rang the bell without being bid ; and Mr. O'Donagough pinched his daughter's cheek, called her a saucy hussy, and said that he'd be hanged if there was such another girl of her years in Europe or out of it. CHAPTER IX. of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby, by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER IX. Discussions respecting the future plans of the O'Donagoughs. Pleasant assurances. Brilliant hopes. Mr. Allen O'Donagough takes a walk, and returns from it exceedingly well satisfied. It will be easily imagined that Mr. and Mrs. O'Donagough, notwithstanding their occasional little tiffs, had found a sufficient number of tranquil moments on board ship, to discuss very fully the important question of what it would be best to do with themselves on first arriving in London. Mrs. O'Donagough very naturally declared that her first and dearest object would be to throw herself into the arms of her beloved Agnes, and once more to embrace the brother of her fond young memory, Mr. Willoughby; for which reasons Berkeley Square rose, as it were, spontaneously to her lips every time the subject of settling themselves was mentioned. But Mr. O'Donagough, who in one way or another had contrived to learn more facts concerning the movements of the fashionable world than had hitherto fallen within the scope of his wife's observation, undertook to assure her that in the month of August there was no chance whatever of finding either Mrs. Hubert or Mr. Willoughby in London. It was therefore necessary to consider what was most desirable in the second degree, and the affectionate Mrs. O'Donagough hinted, just before they left the vessel, that her feelings were becoming so strongly imperative for a reunion, that what she should best like would be to follow her relatives wheresoever they might be, in town or country, seaside or hillside, amidst the enchanting dissipation of a watering place, or the soberer joys of their own rural home. But Mr. O'Donagough thought it might be more prudent to decide for or against this, according to circumstances, and the discussion had been broken off unfinished by the arrival of the custom house officers on board. It was now revived again over the substantial tea table at the Saracen's Head, both parties enjoying the advantage of restored good humour, and the only difference in their mode of treating the subject being, that the lady truly believed the question as to whether they should follow General Hubert to his country house to be in doubt, whereas the gentleman exceedingly well knew that it was not. Mr. Allen O'Donagough certainly had his faults like other mortals, but a positive love of wrangling was not one of them ; and though, of course, like all other sensible married men, he felt the necessity of having his own way, he always achieved it with as little quarrelling as possible. He knew that his Barnaby was a high-spirited woman, by no means disposed to trot very easily under the matrimonial yoke, and decidedly preferring a little skirmish now and then, though she knew that she must yield eventually, to the contemptible submissiveness of living as if she had no will of her own at all. It had therefore become almost habitual to him at all family consultations, respecting the subject of which he had made up his mind beforehand, to let her go on arguing as if it were still in doubt, and uttering his fiat only at the moment when he could walk off and hear no more about it. Respecting the immediate manner of their settling themselves in England, however, he had not quite made up his mind. Not that he had the slightest intention of scouring the country in pursuit of General Hubert, and still less of quartering himself upon his household. Any advantages to be derived from that quarter he was quite aware must be sought for cautiously, and on his part at least with considerable tact. But notwithstanding all his boasting on the subject of identity, he had still a few nervous doubts as to the prudence of launching himself once more upon the town.
True, his sphere of action would be greatly changed ; his age was changed, his beard, with all its fancy et ceteras, was changed ; and though not equally important, his name was changed. Moreover, it was exceedingly probable that the set he had left had changed too ; so that, on the whole, he was pretty sanguine as to the possibility of settling himself as a gentleman of fashion and fortune in London. He really believed that his Barnaby might assist him in this ; which belief assuredly turned aside many a strong word, which without it might have chanced to wound her ears. And it was now with all possible civility that he listened to her, as she again burst forth with all the vehemence of strong affection on the subject of finding out and following Mrs. General Hubert. " I don't think I can live, my dear Donny, till the time you say they are likely to come to town, without seeing her," said Mrs. O'Donagough, laying aside upon the margin of her plate the chicken bone she had been polishing. " Think what a time it is." " Very true, my dear ; only we shall gain one advantage that ought to console you. Were Mrs. Hubert in town at this moment, Mrs. O'Donagough, I should deem it very disadvantageous to introduce Martha to her. You may depend upon it, that none of the finery you may have brought over will be of the right sort here." " That, I have no doubt in the world, is true," replied his wife, rejoicing beyond measure at this positive evidence of his intending to " new rig " them. " Even Patty herself, dear creature, young as she is, feels that, and was just saying so as we came along. But, Lord bless you, my dear Donny, all that can be set to rights in no time, in such a place as London, if you will but let us have the money." " No doubt of it, dear ; but we must be exceedingly careful, I do assure you, in all things concerning that most important article. On some occasions it must be spent, and freely too. There is no help for it, if we hope to do anything important. But for that very reason, we must keep a tight hand over it, where we may do so without danger. Not that I mean to deny you and Patty fine clothes. Quite the contrary. I know they will be often necessary, and if things go well, you shall have them." On hearing this, Martha left her place at the table, where, to say the truth, she had made such good use of her time as to make her remaining there any longer quite unnecessary, and walking round to her father's chair, testified the satisfaction his last words had afforded her, by giving him a kiss. " What ! You like to hear that, do you, Pat? Well, be a good girl, and do all things as I bid you, and you shall be as fine as a queen. So butter me a piece of toast." " Well, but my dearest O'Donagough," said his wife, quite as well pleased by language so encouraging as her daughter, and altogether in a state of mind the most enviable, " you must not forget my darling Agnes. And you may be quite sure, dear, that where she is, we may show off Patty to advantage. For people in their rank of life never do poke themselves in out of the way places. Therefore, I vote for driving to Berkeley square, learning from the servants where the family are passing the summer, take a lodging for a week, just for the purpose of getting the things we most want, and then setting off to enjoy the exquisite pleasure, the heartfelt satisfaction of placing my lovely child in the bosom of my niece, and receiving her little ones into mine. Shall it be so, dearest O'Donagough? Tell me, is there any objection to a plan so every way delightful? "" None in the world, my dear," replied her husband, gravely proceeding with his meal. " Ring the bell, Patty, my dear. I must have a slice or two more ham." " Then I may consider it as settled. Only think, in a week's time I shall present my child, my own beautiful daughter, to the wife of a general, to a lady received at court, with dozens of titles among her nearest relations — and, nevertheless, our nearest relation into the bargain. I'll be hanged, Donny, if it does not all seem like a dream." " I dare say it does, my dear. Give me that backbone, Patty, and thigh along with it, if you will." " Then we may consider it as a settled thing, dear O'Donagough, that we are to follow the Huberts immediately? "" You may consider it as a settled thing, my love, that to set you and Patty off in the very best style is what I intend to do ; and your relations, of course, ought to be among the first to see it." Mrs. Allen O'Donagough was wise enough to take counsel with herself before she said any more upon the subject ; and being, notwithstanding all their seeming consultations on the subject, most utterly ignorant of all her husband's real plots and plans, she was, on the whole, inclined to flatter herself that her wishes respecting their immediate destination would be attended to ; for, as she justly observed to her daughter when they were alone, " Clever as Mr. O'Donagough is about most things, it is quite impossible he should know as much about the dear Huberts as I do." Thus, on the whole, their first evening in London was passed in great domestic harmony ; but Mrs. O'Donagough and her daughter both declaring themselves early ready for bed, Mr. O'Donagough affectionately advised them to yield to the inclination, and saying, almost in the words of Prospero, " 'Tis a good dulness," bid them good night, with the assurance that though he was obliged to go out for half an hour, to get a refractory razor put in order, he should also, probably, be very early in bed. He then kindly lighted candles for them, nay, even opened the door with a smile so gracious and manner so observant, that Mrs. O'Donagough was forcibly reminded of the fascinations of other days ; and when he again wished her good night, as she passed out, she too looked up at him, with a glance as like her former glances as she could make it, at the same time, however, patting his chin playfully, she said, " Oh, why did you cut off your whiskers, dear? "" Why did I cut off my whiskers ?" he repeated, as soon as the door was closed behind them. " That I might sally forth, my charming Barnaby, as I will do this night, with the delightful confidence of being recognised by no one." The sensations produced on an Englishman by returning to London after even a much shorter absence than that of Mr. Allen O'Donagough are always powerful ; and if no particular circumstances exist to injure the effect, exceedingly delightful. The stupendous world it encloses is sure to have spread farther and wider still than when he left it. New displays of wealth, new demonstrations of the power it brings, new proofs of that excess of civilisation which, for lack of other work, turns the genius of man to the production of varieties in every article he uses, because improvement can go no farther. All this he is sure to see at every step he takes ; and then the aspect of all those he meets, at once so familiar to his memory, yet personally so utterly unknown. The features, the complexion, the gait, bringing to his eye and his heart associations 1,000 times more intimately belonging to him, notwithstanding the individual strangeness of each, than he could ever have felt in the foreign land whence he returned. Of all this Mr. Allen O'Donagough was fully conscious, and the excitement it produced was exceedingly agreeable. As he walked farther and farther westward, these pleasant sensations multiplied ; his heart swelled with a well balanced mixture of national and individual triumph ; and, notwithstanding all the awkward accidents of his past life, he would have been sorry to run the risk of changing conditions with any person he met. He knew he must have been a monstrously clever fellow, to be where and what he was at that moment ; and he felt this with a very natural degree of satisfaction at the conviction. After all that had passed, the particulars of which even to himself he did not think it necessary to recapitulate, after all this, at the age of 53, to find himself parading the streets of London, clear as a new born babe from every taint of civil sin, and with his pockets full of cash that no man could seize upon and cry, " Rascal, that cash is mine," was a degree of prosperity that might well make him feel some inches taller than usual as he walked. It was by an impulse that had as much of instinct in it as will, that he at length found himself among the billiard rooms at Leicester Square and its precincts. The unsightly Palais Royal of London surrounded him on all sides ; and as he looked at its increased glow of gaslight, and breathed the queer mixture with which it has there pleased man to supply his lungs, in lieu of atmospheric air, he felt that he was once again at home. It would have required a much stronger effort than he conceived himself called upon to make, to avoid entering beneath one of the many roofs, which by night and day sheltered the devotees who passed their existence in making 3 little ivory balls run about and knock each other. He did enter, and mounting the stairs with a step as eager, though less active than heretofore, found himself, not without some emotion, on a spot where he had stood 1,000 times before. There were many persons in the room, but he looked around, and saw not one single face that he remembered, till the marker, changing his place, displayed to him features once as familiar to his eye as the dial on which he scored his games ; but with an expression which, though not changed, was marked by lines so much stronger and deeper than heretofore, that the man looked like a caricature of his former self. At first sight of him, Mr. Allen O'Donagough started, and felt half inclined to turn about, and make his exit before he had caught his eye. But his better judgment told him that by so doing he would lose an excellent opportunity of testing the effect of his altered appearance on an old acquaintance, and be forced to try it where it might perhaps be much more dangerous to fail. He therefore stood his ground, and when he perceived that the man's eye rested quietly and steadily on him, without the slightest indication of ever having examined his features before, his confidence increased sufficiently to lead him into conversation. The result was all that he desired. His observations were sufficiently scientific to merit even a marker's attention, and the man both looked at and listened to him, but still without betraying any trace of remembrance whatever. While suffering some little anxiety from his doubts how this experience might answer, Mr. Allen O'Donagough probably forgot the great advantage, under existing circumstances, of 15 years which had passed over his curls since he had last appeared before the eyes which so fortunately knew him not. Of all his advantages, perhaps this was the only one of which our ci devant major was not fully sensible. Nothing could exceed the lightness and gaiety of heart which ensued upon this successful experiment. He felt himself born again into the only world in which he wished to live. His outward skin, somewhat the worse for the wear, cast off, all his talents ripened, and his character and name without a stain. There was one triumph more, a touch of which he was determined to enjoy without further delay. Mr. Allen O'Donagough had played billiards when he left England, but he played so much better now that he could not but fancy his chance with the professional individual who had formerly been the object of his emulation and his envy, would be very different from what it was in days past. He accordingly engaged him as soon as the tables should be at leisure; and when the moment arrived, set about the game with almost as zealous a desire to win it, as if he had staked 10 times the amount they were to play for. The play of Mr. Allen O'Donagough was certainly improved; perhaps that of the marker was improved also; but neither the one nor the other had lost or forgotten any of those little peculiar touches of skill which distinguish one great billiard man from another. The marker's eye had perused the person and countenance of the new comer, something as an athlete of old might have done the conformation of one about to wrestle with him; and this survey had brought no single trait or movement to his mind, which suggested a suspicion that they had ever met before. No sooner, however, were the balls in full action, than a particular stroke, for which our Major had been famous, awakened some long forgotten manoeuvrings in the marker's mind, and he suddenly turned round and directed a stare pregnant with inquiry into the stranger's face. " Beg your pardon, sir, but may I ask your name? " said the man, with great civility. " O'Donagough? What is your reason for asking? " was the reply. But as he made it, the colour mounted over the ample cheeks of the incognito, and he felt he had made a blunder. " Only because that pretty hazard of yours put me so in mind of a chap that used to play here half a score years ago, or more, maybe ; and I don't remember to have seen exact the same stroke from any other man." " Do you know this stroke? " demanded Mr. Allen O'Donagough, recovering himself, and performing a very skilful manoeuvre that he had learned from a New Orleans man, with whom he had played at Sydney. " No, sir, no, upon my soul. That is quite a foreign stroke, I take it. You have played abroad, sir, I'll be bound." " I learnt that at New Orleans," replied Mr. Allen O'Donagough. " No wonder, sir, that you're a good player, then ; for I have known New Orleans men as have beat us all hollow." Mr. Allen O'Donagough won his game and retired, having received a hint which he felt might be very useful to him. " Egad, I must shave my play as well as my moustache, if I intend to remain incog," was the thought that passed through his head, as he gaily proceeded to reconnoitre, during another hour or so, the various alterations, additions, and improvements made during his absence throughout all the regions that he knew and loved best. But, like a prudent domestic man as he was, he returned soon after midnight to the Saracen's Head, having just done and seen enough to make him equally sanguine and impatient as regarded the variety of brilliant experiments which lay before him. CHAPTER X.